When my mother, Milani, married Michael, it felt like our lives were being packed into a shiny new box, one with perfectly tied ribbons and a promise of something better. Michael came with wealth, a sprawling home that seemed to swallow our modest apartment whole, and his daughter, Eliza. Eliza, with her glossy blonde hair and an effortless charm, was everything I was not. At least, that's how Mom made it seem. From the start, it became clear who the star of this new family dynamic was. Mom doted on Eliza like she had discovered the daughter she always wanted. Every meal, every conversation, every plan seemed to orbit around her. At first, I told myself it was just the excitement of blending two families together. I even tried to bond with Eliza, asking about her favorite shows or her life before us. But she'd flash me a polite, disinterested smile and drift back to her phone or friends. The gap between us wasn't just in our ages, but in our worlds. It all came to a head one evening during dinner. Michael had ordered takeout from some fancy Italian restaurant, the kind of food that made my stomach growl just from the smell. We gathered around the massive dining table, and I was halfway through a story about my latest art project when Mom cut me off mid-sentence. She turned to Eliza and asked her about her upcoming recital. The room shifted. Suddenly, everyone's attention was on Eliza, and my words dissolved like vapor. I sat there, invisible, while she talked about costumes, rehearsals, and how she'd been chosen for solo. Mom clapped her hands together like a delighted child. Michael smiled with pride. I forced a smile too, but inside, something cracked. Later that night, as we were clearing the table, Mom said something that left me frozen. She glanced at my unfinished sketchbook lying on the counter and muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Maybe if you focused more on practical skills, you'd have something to contribute, like Eliza." It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, the deliberate comparison, the weight of years of trying to make her proud crashing down at once. I wanted to scream, to tell her about every late night spent perfecting my craft, about how art made me feel alive. But instead, I bit my tongue and carried the plates to the sink. From that day forward, the divide grew. Eliza thrived under Mom's constant praise, while I felt like a shadow, present but unnoticed. Michael, though kind in his way, never stepped in to level the playing field. He seemed content as long as everyone played their roles. And mine, apparently, was to shrink. The tipping point came a few weeks later. It was a Saturday, and Michael had decided we should all work together to organize the garage. Eliza mostly stood around, scrolling through her phone, while I wrestled with dusty boxes. At one point, I accidentally knocked over a stack of books. The sound echoed, sharp and jarring. Mom's voice cut through the air like a whip. She scolded me for being careless, her words dripping with disappointment. Eliza, standing behind her, smirked. And Michael, instead of defending me, placed a reassuring hand on Mom's shoulder as if to validate her outrage. I could feel tears welling up, but I refused to let them fall. Not there.
Not in front of them.
I muttered an apology and retreated to my room, my sanctuary in a house that no longer felt like home. There, surrounded by my sketches and paints, I let the tears flow. They weren't just tears of sadness, but of frustration, of feeling so profoundly unseen. Despite it all, I tried to adapt. I tried to find my place in this new family, to bridge the gap with Eliza, to earn even a sliver of Mom's approval. But every attempt seemed to reinforce what I already knew. I was the odd one out. The daughter, who didn't fit the new narrative. In quiet moments, I found myself wondering if it was worth it. If trying to belong in a family that clearly didn't want me was a battle I could ever win. And yet, deep down, there was a part of me that refused to give up. Not because I believed things would get better, but because I wasn't ready to let them define my worth. The cracks in our family's foundation were growing, and I could feel them shifting beneath my feet. It wasn't a matter of if things would collapse, but when. And I knew, somehow, that I'd need to be ready when they did. The discovery was accidental, but the impact was seismic. I had been searching for a pair of scissors in the study, a room that Michael had claimed as his office, but which often became a dumping ground for important papers. While rummaging through a drawer, My eyes landed on a folder labeled with my name. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it, only to find something that made my stomach churn. Inside was a financial statement detailing my university fund. It wasn't the fund itself that shocked me. It was the annotation scribbled in Michael's neat handwriting. Potential reallocation for Eliza's tuition, it read. My mind raced. The fund was meant for me, carefully built over years by my father, Thomas. And now my stepfather was planning to hand it over to Eliza? It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I confronted Mom that evening, waiting until Michael was home so they could both face me together. The living room, usually sterile and impersonal, became a battleground. I held up the folder, my hand trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Why is my university fund being discussed for Eliza's tuition? I demanded. Mom's face hardened, a defensive mask slipping into place. Michael, standing beside her, looked more annoyed than guilty. Mom dismissed my concerns as if I were overreacting, saying that the fund was a family resource now and that Eliza's education was a priority. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For years, I had watched my father meticulously save for my future, sacrificing luxuries so that I could have opportunities he never had. And now, in a matter of months, this family had decided that Eliza deserved those opportunities more than I did. The argument escalated quickly. I accused them of favoritism, of erasing everything my father had worked for. Mom's voice rose to match mine, calling me ungrateful and selfish. Michael tried to play mediator, but his condescending tone only fueled my anger. He spoke of fairness and what's best for the family, as if I were an outsider questioning their decisions. It was the first time I openly stood up to my mother, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. I told her that she had failed me, that her obsession with pleasing Eliza had blinded her to my needs. Her response was cutting. She said I was jealous, that I'd always been difficult, and that I needed to grow up. The final blow came when Michael suggested that if I couldn't accept their decisions, maybe it was time I considered alternative living arrangements. It was a subtle threat, but the message was clear. I didn't belong here anymore. That night, I packed a bag. I knew I couldn't stay in a house where my worth was measured against Eliza's convenience. There was only one place I could go, my grandfather Henry's home. Grandpa Henry had always been a constant in my life, a source of quiet wisdom and unwavering support. He lived alone in a modest house a few towns over, and while it wasn't luxurious, it was warm and safe. When I showed up at his doorstep, my eyes red from crying, he didn't ask questions. He simply pulled me into a hug and said, "You're always welcome here." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Living with Grandpa Henry was a stark contrast to the tension and chaos I had left behind. He encouraged me to focus on my art, turning his small den into a makeshift studio where I could lose myself in sketches and colors. He listened without judgment as I vented about Mom, Michael, and Eliza. And most importantly, he reminded me that I mattered. As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel a sense of clarity. I wasn't just angry about the university fund. I was angry about everything it represented. The constant dismissal, the unfair comparisons, the erosion of my identity within my own family. But here, in Grandpa Henry's house, I started to rebuild. I wasn't just a shadow anymore. I was Lindsay, and I was worth fighting for. Still, the thought of that folder haunted me. I couldn't let them take what was rightfully mine. Not without a fight. Grandpa Henry suggested I speak to a lawyer, someone who could help me understand my rights. It was a daunting idea, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that standing up for myself wasn't just an option. It was necessary. By the time I made the call to Mr. Jackson, a local attorney with a reputation for fairness, I felt a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my future, about proving that I wouldn't be silenced or sidelined. And while I didn't know what the outcome would be, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to back down. Grandpa Henry had fallen ill a few weeks before his passing, and I had spent as much time as I could at the hospital. The sterile smell of disinfectant and the steady beeping of monitors became a backdrop to our conversations. He always greeted me with a smile, even when his strength was waning. "I'm feeling better today, Lindsay," he would say, his voice warm despite the strain.
"Don't you worry about me."
"You've got your whole life ahead of you, and that's what matters." I tried to believe him, clinging to his reassurances like a lifeline. I brought him sketches from my latest projects, and he would examine them with genuine interest, offering little bits of encouragement that reminded me why I loved creating. He made the hospital room feel less cold, less final. But deep down, I knew. I saw the way the nurses looked at me, the careful phrasing of the doctors when they updated me on his condition. I told myself I was prepared, that I'd cherish every moment and hold on to the memories. Yet when the call came early in the morning, waking me from a rare, peaceful sleep, nothing could have braced me for it. Grandpa Henry had passed away. The words didn't fully register at first. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the phone, as if willing it to give me a different reality. But the truth settled in quickly, heavy and cold. The only place that had felt like home was now just an empty shell. The days leading up to the funeral were a blur of grief and logistics. I spent hours in Grandpa's house, sorting through his belongings and finding little reminders of the life we shared. Every drawer, every photograph, every old sketchbook carried a memory, a reminder of his steady presence and the way he always believed in me. The world felt unmoored without him. When the day of the funeral arrived, I felt a mix of dread and determination. I knew my mother and Michael would be there, and likely Eliza too. They hadn't seen me since I moved out, and I wasn't sure how I'd face them. But this day wasn't about them. It was about Grandpa Henry, and I owed it to him to say goodbye. The church was small and intimate, filled with the few people who had known and loved him. As I sat in the front pew, surrounded by flowers and somber faces, I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment marked the end of something far greater than just a life. It was the end of a sanctuary, of the one person who had never made me feel like I was less. After the service, we gathered at the house for a small reception. The atmosphere was heavy, a mix of shared loss and awkward tension. Mom and Michael arrived late, their polished appearances at odds with the raw grief in the room. Eliza trailed behind them, looking as disinterested as ever. I tried to avoid them, focusing instead on the guests who had come to pay their respects. But it didn't take long for the inevitable confrontation. Mom called me aside, her expression a mixture of forced sympathy and something sharper. She wasted no time before bringing up the house. "You know, Lindsay, this house is far too big for you to manage on your own," she said, her tone dripping with faux concern. "It would make sense to consolidate it into the family's assets." Her words sent a jolt of anger through me. Grandpa Henry hadn't even been gone a week, and she was already circling like a vulture. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "Grandpa's will hasn't even been read yet," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." But the truth was, I was terrified. I hadn't seen the will, and for all I knew, Mom might have a claim to the house. The thought of losing the one place that still felt like Grandpa was unbearable. The next few days were a nightmare. Mom and Michael started treating the house like it was already theirs. They rearranged furniture to make it more functional, as Michael put it, and even went through Grandpa's belongings, deciding what should stay and what should go. Eliza, emboldened by their behavior, took it a step further. One evening, I returned to find my room stripped bare. My sketches, books, and personal items had been packed away or tossed into a pile in the hallway. The bed had been made up with new linens, and Eliza's belongings were neatly arranged on the desk and shelves. "This room suits Eliza better," Mom said when I confronted her, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "You'll find space in one of the guest rooms for now." The sting of that moment cut deeper than I expected. My sanctuary, the one space where I still felt connected to Grandpa, was gone. And the ease with which they had dismissed me, as if I were an inconvenience to be shuffled around, only reinforced how little I mattered in their eyes. The reading of the will took place a few days later in Mr. Jackson's office. The room was stark and formal, a far cry from the warmth of Grandpa's home. Mom and Michael sat on one side, their expressions a mix of anticipation and entitlement. I sat alone on the other, clutching the armrest of my chair like it was a lifeline. Mr. Jackson was a no-nonsense man, his voice calm and deliberate as he went through the legal formalities. When he reached the part about the house, my heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. To my granddaughter Lindsay, he read, I leave the entirety of my estate, including the house, its contents, and all associated assets. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Relief and disbelief washed over me in equal measure. But the silence that followed was quickly broken by Mom's outburst. She launched into a tirade, accusing Mr. Jackson of manipulating the will, accusing me of brainwashing Grandpa, accusing everyone but herself of wrongdoing. Michael tried to calm her down, but her anger was a force of nature. She demanded that the will be contested, her voice rising with each accusation. Mr. Jackson remained unflappable, patiently explaining that the will had been properly prepared and witnessed. There was no legal basis for her claims. The scene was surreal. Mom, who had always prided herself on appearances, was unraveling in front of me. Eliza sat quietly in the corner, her face blank, as if the drama didn't concern her. And Michael, for all his posturing, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. When it was over, I left the office with a copy of the will in hand and a newfound sense of empowerment. Grandpa Henry had believed in me enough to entrust me with everything he had, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away. Back at the house, I stood in the den where I had spent so many hours with Grandpa. The grief was still there, heavy and unyielding, but so was something else. A resolve, a determination to honor his memory by making this place my own. The challenges weren't over. Mom's reaction made that clear. But for the first time, I felt like I had the strength to face them. This house wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of everything Grandpa Henry had stood for. And I was ready to fight for it. The day I reclaimed Grandpa Henry's house felt like the turning point I'd been waiting for. With the will firmly on my side, I had the legal power to make decisions that had once felt like distant fantasies. The first step was ensuring that my mother, her husband Michael, and their perfect daughter Eliza understood that this house was no longer theirs to command. I arrived early in the morning, armed with a locksmith and a determination that coursed through me like fire. As the locksmith worked on replacing the locks, I began gathering their belongings. Every item, clothes, electronics, even the tasteless decorative vases they had brought into the house, was boxed up and carried to the front yard. I'd lived through the humiliation of finding my things discarded, my room turned into Eliza's personal palace. Now it was their turn to feel the sting of being unwelcome. By the time they returned from wherever they had gone, the front yard was a chaotic display of boxes and bags. The sight of their possessions scattered in the open air was a stark reversal of what they had done to me. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. It didn't take long. Mom's car pulled into the driveway, followed by Michael's. They stepped out, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief and, finally, to fury. Eliza, trailing behind them, looked embarrassed but said nothing. Mom marched up to the porch, her voice already rising. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at the boxes. "You can't just throw us out like this." "Actually, I can," I replied, my voice steady. "This house belongs to me. Grandpa Henry left it to me in his will, and I'm done letting you treat it like your playground." Michael stepped forward, attempting to play the voice of reason. "Lindsay, let's be adults about this. There's no need for such dramatics. We can work something out." I cut him off before he could continue. "You mean like how you worked out turning my room into Eliza's? Or how you worked out tossing Grandpa's belongings without a second thought?" "No, Michael, we're past working things out." Mom's face contorted with anger. "You're being vindictive," she spat. "We're family, Lindsay. Families don't do this to each other." Her words stung, not because I believed them, but because of the sheer hypocrisy. "Family?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You're only family when it's convenient for you. You didn't care about being family when you tossed my things out of my room or tried to steal the house from me. Don't you dare lecture me about family." For a moment, there was silence. Then Mom's expression shifted, softening into something that almost looked like desperation. "Lindsay, please," she said, her tone quieter now. "Can't we just stay here as a family?" The plea was so absurd it almost made me laugh. Instead, I looked her in the eye and said, "No. You made your choices, and now you can live with them. This house is mine, and I won't let you manipulate me into giving it up." Michael's frustration boiled over. "You're making a mistake," he snapped. "You'll regret this." I met his glare with one of my own. "The only thing I regret is not standing up for myself sooner." As they began gathering their things, the reality of the situation seemed to sink in. Eliza, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "This is stupid," she muttered, shooting me a withering look. "You're just bitter." I didn't bother responding. Her opinion of me didn't matter, just as mine clearly hadn't mattered to her. The three of them packed their cars in tense silence, shooting me occasional glares as they worked. By the time they drove off, the front yard was clear, and the house was finally mine again. Once they were gone, I stepped back inside and locked the door. The silence was deafening, but it was a welcome change. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I walked through the house, room by room, taking in the space that was now truly mine. Standing in the den, surrounded by Grandpa's books and the faint smell of his favorite pipe tobacco, I felt a swell of emotion. This house wasn't just a place to live. It was a testament to everything Grandpa had believed in: resilience, fairness, and the courage to stand up for what's right. I had finally honored his legacy, and I knew he'd be proud. The road ahead wasn't clear. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But as I stood there, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, I knew one thing for certain: I was ready for whatever came next. As I began settling into the stillness of the house, I stumbled upon a letter tucked inside one of Grandpa Henry's old journals. The envelope bore my name in his familiar, careful handwriting, and my hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a message from him, written during his final days. The words were a balm to my wounded soul. He wrote about the strength he saw in me, the determination he admired, and his unwavering belief that I could overcome anything. He acknowledged the challenges I had faced and told me to trust myself, even when the world seemed against me. Grandpa's letter wasn't just a goodbye. It was a lifeline, a reminder that I was capable of creating a future worth fighting for. With his words echoing in my mind, I knew I couldn't allow my recent struggles to define me. This house, now wholly mine, was more than a shelter. It was a symbol of the battles I had fought and won. I resolved to turn it into a place of growth and inspiration, not just for me, but for anyone who might need it. I threw myself into my studies, rekindling the passion I'd once had for my art. Grandpa had always believed in the power of creativity, and I felt closer to him with every sketch and stroke of paint. The quiet corners of the house became my sanctuary, a space where I could explore my ideas and bring them to life. The emptiness that had once felt so heavy was slowly replaced with purpose. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. My mother's attempts to contest the will didn't end with a single outburst. Over the following months, she made several attempts to challenge my ownership of the house, each one more desperate than the last. With the help of Mr. Jackson, I navigated the legal complexities and stood my ground. Every victory in court was a reminder that I had the strength to protect what mattered. Amidst the chaos, I found unexpected allies. Neighbors who had known Grandpa Henry for years reached out with their support, sharing stories about his kindness and the impact he'd had on their lives. Their words fortified my resolve and reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I had once felt. One afternoon, as I was clearing out the attic, I discovered a box of photographs and letters from Grandpa's younger days. Among them was a picture of him standing in front of this very house, his arm draped around a woman who must have been my grandmother. The joy on their faces was unmistakable, and it filled me with a sense of connection to the history of this place. It wasn't just a house. It was a repository of love, resilience, and dreams. As the seasons changed, so did I. The bitterness that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence. I started to see the beauty in the ordinary. The way sunlight streamed through the windows in the mornings, the creak of the wooden floors beneath my feet, the scent of Grandpa's favorite flowers blooming in the garden. These small moments grounded me, reminding me of the life I was building. Reflecting on the journey, I realized that family isn't just defined by blood. True family are the people who see you for who you are, who stand by you when the world feels heavy, and who celebrate your victories, no matter how small. Grandpa Henry had been that for me, and his unwavering belief in me had given me the courage to carve out my own path. I decided to honor his legacy in a way that felt true to both of us. I transformed one of the downstairs rooms into a small art studio, open to local kids and teens who needed a creative outlet. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Seeing their faces light up as they explored their creativity reminded me of the joy Grandpa had always found in encouraging others. Standing in the den one evening, surrounded by the life I was rebuilding, I felt a profound sense of peace. The echoes of the past were no longer haunting, they were guiding me forward. Grandpa's letter sat framed on the desk, a constant reminder of the strength and love that had carried me through the darkest times. This house, this life, was mine to shape, and while the road ahead remained uncertain, I knew I was ready to embrace it, one step, one brushstroke, one moment at a time.